So, welcome to this class on Neuroscience of Human Movement. So, this is part 8 of our discussion on cerebellum. So, in this class we will introduce and start the discussion on cerebrocerebellum and how cerebrocerebellum plays a crucial role in planning and regulation of movements. So, cerebrocerebellum is the later cerebellum or is considered to be evolutionarily advanced cerebellum, which is the reason this is also called as neocerebellum. We have discussed this in a previous class that cerebrocerebellum is the newest addition evolutionarily. So, this is called as the neocerebellum, and since it receives inputs from the pons, mainly from the pons, it is called as pontocerebellum. So, the inputs it receives from the pons are the mossy fibers, is it not? Mossy fiber input from pons. Where does pons receive its input from? Obviously, it is receiving inputs. So, this is because cerebral cortex, okay, cerebral cortex to pons to cerebrocerebellum. So, the pons are those areas of pons that project to the cerebrocerebellum, receive inputs from cerebral cortex. Okay. For a long time it is believed that cerebrocerebellum and cerebellum in general is a motor organ of the brain. In other words, it is its main function is to plan, regulate and modulate movements, whereas now this view is being challenged that it also has other functions other than motor functions. It also performs cognitive and other functions. This view is now gaining traction, but this is a relatively new view and evidence is just getting built up to support this notion. Okay. For now in this course we are interested in movements and movement related movement related functions. So, we will restrict our discussion to movement related functions of the cerebrocerebellum. So, once again we go back to the outline picture of the cerebellum, and here we discuss cerebrocerebellum. So, pontine nuclei or pons receives inputs from cerebral cortex, and from there is a projection to the dentate nucleus. So, it's big. So, that must be dentate nucleus, it is shown here, that is the dentate nucleus. We are showing we are illustrating only one side, but this is happening on both sides of the cerebellum. So, of course, these are interposed nuclei and that is the fastigial nucleus. These are the outputs, these are the output nuclei of the cerebellum or the deep cerebellar nuclei. They are shown outside the cerebellum for illustration purposes, but they are actually embedded here. They are actually embedded within the cerebellum. Okay, they are shown outside for convenience, for illustration purpose. So, the pontine nuclei project first on the one hand project directly to the dentate nucleus, but the dentate nucleus also receives input from the cerebellar cortex. What is this input? This is the Purkinje cell input, is it not? This is the Purkinje cell input, and there is comparison that happens at this point. We have seen this during our discussion. We have seen this during our discussion of the cerebellar microcircuit. So, the dentate nucleus compares the input it receives from the mossy fibers and also the inputs it receives from the Purkinje cells. This comparison also, of course, there are other comparisons that happen within the cerebellar cortex, but this is one of the many comparisons that happen. So, the dentate nucleus receives input from the pontine nucleus and also from the cerebellar cortex or the Purkinje cell input from the cerebellar cortex. From there it projects. So, this input is coming via the middle cerebellar peduncle, and from there the dentate nucleus it projects to the ventrolateral thalamus, and from the ventrolateral thalamus back to the cerebral cortex, right. So, this is one of two important outputs. One is to projecting back to the cerebral cortex via the ventrolateral thalamus. The other one we will discuss in a bit. Okay. So, to review this, just briefly. So, pons receives inputs from the cerebral cortex. From the pontine nuclei there is projection back to the dentate nucleus, and via the cerebellar cortex to the dentate nucleus, where there is a comparison that is happening from the dentate nucleus to the ventrolateral thalamus, and from the ventrolateral thalamus back to the cerebral cortex, thus forming one loop, right. This is forming one loop. And note the output from the dentate nucleus is through the superior peduncle, the input is through the middle cerebellar peduncle, okay. And actually the other output, so one output is through the dentate nucleus, so that is the cerebellum, which is basically the most lateral parts of the cerebellum. The more medial parts are called as vermis, and the paravermal area or the intermediate zone, these constitute the spinocerebellum, which we discussed in the previous class, and the flocculonodular lobe constitutes the flocculonodular lobe that constitutes the vestibular cerebellum. We have seen these things previously. So, that area, the more medial region, constitutes the spinocerebellum. The more lateral region, which is that, contributes the cerebrocerebellum, okay. So, once again that constitutes the cerebrocerebellum, and that is the deep cerebellar nucleus, which is the dentate nucleus, right. So, the dentate nucleus, from there are at least two projections. One is to the ventrolateral thalamus, this here shown here, and the other is to the red nucleus, right. So, from the red nucleus there is projection, of course, to the spinal cord via the rubrospinal tract, we have seen this, and from the cortex or from the ventrolateral thalamus it reaches to the primary and premotor area, and from the cortex there is corticospinal tract, we have seen this. Now, it is believed that the red nucleus also receives input from the premotor and the primary motor cortex. So, that is that region, right. So, it receives input from the dentate nucleus and the primary and premotor cortex, and since these regions receives input on two different aspects, one is a planned movement and the other is the control command, it is believed that there is the mental rehearsal of movements that is happening. I want to do this, how am I going to do this type of mental rehearsal of movements is happening in this recurrent loop that involves the red nucleus, primary motor cortex, premotor cortex, and mainly the premotor cortex or the association cortex, and the dentate nucleus. So, the dentate nucleus sends one form of input, the premotor cortex sends another form of input. This comparison or this mental rehearsal is probably due to the activity that happens in the red nucleus. So, this is an interesting, intriguing hypothesis concerning the function of red nucleus or the projections that red nucleus receives from the dentate nucleus and the primary motor cortex and premotor cortex areas, right. Also, it is to be noted that red nucleus projects to inferior olive in another recurrent circuit. So, what happens is that the cerebral cortex projects to the cerebellar cortex via the pons, cerebellar cortex and to deep cerebellar nucleus. So, there are two, and then from here to there. So, there are two comparisons, right. So, there are two projections, one projects directly to the deep cerebellar nucleus, the other one projects to the cerebellar cortex, which then projects back via the Purkinje neurons, right. So, that happens, and this projection is and then from the dentate nucleus, from the output nucleus, from the dentate nucleus there is projection to actually to the inferior olive, how? Via the contralateral red nucleus, right. So, then this inferior olive neurons send information back to the deep nucleus and to the cortex as climbing fibers. Whereas these cells or these fibers that originate from pons are of course massive fibers, is it not so? This constitutes one recurrent loop. So, from the deep nucleus through to the inferior olive nucleus via the red nucleus, via the contralateral red nucleus, from the inferior olive back to the cerebellum as climbing fibers. So, this constitutes another of the recurrent loops. Okay. So, to discuss or to summarize, so there is an idea, there is an intention to make a movement. So, that is probably happening in the frontal areas, and that is communicated to the association or the motor association areas of the premotor cortex supplemented. There are multiple numbers of this, we have discussed the details in the previous classes, there are many of these, and then that is communicated to the motor cortex, but it turns out when the movement is happening, it is receiving feedback, or cerebellum is receiving one form of feedback, the motor cortex is receiving feedback via the somatosensory cortex and association cortices, right. Also note that basal ganglia participates in movement modulation, and motor cortex also controls inputs to the basal ganglia. Cerebellum projects back to the motor cortex via the VL thalamus, and motor cortex also sends its inputs to the cerebellum via the pons. So, this is via the pons. So, there are multiple loops, multiple feedback circuits that are received. So, there is feedback about the movement via the somatosensory association cortex, there is also feedback that is sensed by the cerebellum, which then sends appropriate corrective commands to the motor cortex or to the brainstem regions, right. So, in this cerebellum also forms a crucial element of the movement modulation and movement regulation system. The other element obviously that participates in the movement modulation or regulation system is basal ganglia, that forms the discussion for some of the future classes, but we are not done with cerebellum yet. And of course, motor cortex controls movements. We have seen how it controls movements in the previous classes. Okay. So, with this we come to the end of this lecture. So, in this class we discussed the role of cerebellum in planning and regulation of movements. We discussed in particular there are two loops, one is to the cerebral cortex via the ventrolateral thalamus through dentate nucleus, and to the red nucleus or the recurrent loop involving red nucleus and inferior olive. We will continue our discussion on cerebrocerebellum in the next class. So, thank you very much for your attention.